As the devastating war in Ukraine continues grinding on without a clear end in sight, tensions are rapidly rising in another nation that borders Russia, who the Kremlin has previously invaded twice in only the past 3 decades: Georgia. In May of 2024, hundreds of thousands of Georgian citizens took to the streets in their nation's capital, Tbilisi, to protest against their government's passing of a new and highly controversial law in the country. The ruling party that governs in Georgia, the Georgian Dream Party, officially refers to this new law as the Transparency of Foreign Influence Bill. Once it enters into law, the bill will require that all NGOs and media companies operating in Georgia who receive more than 20% of their funding from abroad to register themselves as pursuing the interests of a foreign power in a public registry. The Georgian Dream Party argues that this bill is necessary to provide transparency on where NGOs and media companies in Georgia are receiving their funding from. But critics and opponents of the bill argue that it's almost identical to a similar law that was passed by Vladimir Putin's government in Russia back in 2012, which has enabled the Russian government ever since to suppress, crack down on, and shut down opposition media outlets and NGOs in the country. A pattern that could be replicated by the Georgian Dream Party to suppress the opposition in Georgia, too. For this reason, opponents of the Foreign Influence Bill have labeled it as the Russian law, but it's not the only reason why they've been calling it that. Because the bill's passing likely also carries with it tremendous geopolitical benefits for the Kremlin, too. Because it'll probably prevent Georgia from becoming accepted into the European Union and NATO as well. Both the EU and NATO have repeatedly stressed that Georgia's passing of the new Foreign Influence Bill will make them incompatible with their values, and that it will jeopardize Georgia's membership prospects as a result. For decades, most Georgians have long aspired to become a member of both blocs of nations, with current polling showing that almost 80% of the Georgian population desires their country to join the European Union, and another poll showing that roughly 87% of Georgians see the ongoing war in Ukraine as a shared cause. Having themselves been invaded by Russia twice in the past 3 decades, that resulted in 20% of their own internationally recognized territory falling under Russian military occupation. It was only a few months ago in December of 2023 when Georgia was finally offered its long-awaited and much-coveted candidacy status by the European Union, which, if one day approved into a fully fledged member state, would establish a disconnected chunk of the European Union across the Black Sea over in Western Asia, wedged in between Russia and Turkey, which would also make Georgia the 5th EU member state to share a direct border with Russia, after Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland. But it was only 4 months after Georgia received its EU candidacy status that the ruling Georgia Dream Party decided to reintroduce their controversial foreign influence law again. You see, the party had originally introduced the bill back in February of 2023, but after fierce protests erupted in the capital city against it, the bill was quickly withdrawn. This time, with the bill back in 2024, however, the Georgian government's response to the protesters has been significantly more heavy-handed than they ever were before, involving water cannons, tear gas, and even rubber bullets, as the Georgian Dream Party has made it explicitly clear that they are determined to pass the new law through regardless of how unpopular it might be, and regardless of how much it jeopardizes their ability to actually join the EU and NATO. There is therefore a major concern growing that the Georgian government is actively drifting the country back into the orbit of Russia again. A concern that hasn't been helped by many other of the government's actions recently, such as their arrest and imprisonment of the former pro-Western Georgian president and Ukrainian citizen Mikhail Saakashvili since 2021, the refusal to participate in any sanctions on Russia since the invasion of Ukraine, the resumption of direct air travel with Russia since 2023, and their dramatically increased trade volume with Russia since the invasion of Ukraine started, with Georgian exports to Russia rising by nearly 7% in 2022, and Georgian imports from Russia skyrocketing by 79% over the same time period. This has led the Ukrainian government to frequently criticize the Georgian government of assisting the Russians in evading sanctions, and tensions between them have gotten so high recently that Kyiv recalled their ambassador to Tbilisi in June of 2022. And then, shortly after Georgia resumed the direct flights with Russia in 2023, Kyiv even expelled the Georgian ambassador from their country, and announced sanctions on Georgian airways as a consequence. And then, later in September of 2023, the Speaker of the Georgian parliament even asserted that Ukraine was plotting a coup in Georgia to overthrow the Georgian Dream Party and push the country into the war with Russia. Since then, the Georgian government has repeatedly accused both the United States and Ukraine of attempting to push Georgia into joining the war against Russia, to reclaim their occupied territories and to open up a second front for the Kremlin to have to deal with. And they've even gone so far as to openly accuse the US of plotting a coup in the country and fomenting the current high levels of unrest going on against them. And all of this is increasingly coming to the delight of Russia, who has openly praised the ruling Georgian Dream Party and its new foreign influence bill, while they still occupy 20% of Georgia's internationally recognized territory. Russia has also long maintained its own policy of keeping Georgia out of the EU and NATO as much as possible, just like they've done in Ukraine, because like Ukraine, Georgia occupies an extremely important piece on the board of global geopolitics, especially from the perspective of Moscow. It is a space that both the West and Russia want to control and keep within their own respective camps for a plethora of important reasons. And in order to understand why, it helps to begin with sheer geography. Georgia is often considered to be a transcontinental country because it exists at the hard-to-define crossroads between Eastern Europe and Western Asia. The country's claimed territory straddles most of the Greater Caucasus mountain range, historically a valuable geographic frontier region separating the vast, flat Eurasian steppe in southern Russia from the great empires that emerged in Western Asia like the Turks and the Persians. The region of the Caucasus has long been a battleground area for influence in the center between all three of these greater neighboring empires around it. And so, for centuries, the Russians have maintained a strong policy of controlling at least the Greater Caucasus Mountains in order to control all of the access points from Western Asia into southern Russia, where it's basically just flat, easily traversable land all the way from there to Ukraine and Volgograd, which, if captured, would isolate Russia from the Black and Caspian Seas. Geographically speaking, there are really only 4 viable overland transportation routes to take to travel through or around the Greater Caucasus Mountains today. There are the 2 narrow coastal approaches to the west and the east of the mountains between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, while the only 2 routes in between that run through or over the mountains are the Georgian military road here that follows the traditional mountain pass route used by invaders and merchants for centuries, and the nearby Roki Tunnel, a tunnel pass going through the mountains that was only built during the Soviet era and completed in 1984. If all 4 of these routes can be effectively controlled by Russia, then they can essentially control all land-based travel between Western Asia and Russia. And so, they can block any hostile land army from advancing from this direction into the exposed steppe of southern Russia that is significantly more challenging to defend. Historically, this was Russia's primary concern with controlling the area around the Greater Caucasus Mountains, which included Georgia. Georgia was steadily annexed by the Russians in the early 19th century in a piecemeal fashion, and then remained within the Russian Empire until the country collapsed during the First World War in 1917. Georgia then managed to briefly emerge as an independent republic before it was swallowed back up again by the Red Army in 1921 and incorporated into the new Soviet Union. Georgia was then, as it still is today, an ethnically and linguistically diverse place because of its mountainous geography. The Georgians were by far the largest single group and always made up a majority, but there were large minorities of Azerbaijanis, Armenians, Russians, Greeks, and 2 important lesser-known groups, known as the Ossetians and the Abkhazians. The Ossetians are a disconnected Iranian ethnic group, more closely related to Kurds and Persians than any of their neighbors who straddle the border between Russia and Georgia, while the Abkhazians are a small Caucasian ethnic group, most closely related to the Circassians to the north in Russia. After the Soviet Union came to control the region, they established the Georgian Soviet Republic as a full union republic of the country. But within this republic, they also created the South Ossetian Autonomous Oblast, and the Abkhaz Autonomous Republic as well, which each maintained a high degree of autonomy separate from the rest of Georgia. This is how things largely remained within Georgia for decades until the Soviet Union began collapsing in 1989, and Georgian, Ossetian, and Abkhaz nationalism all began increasing in the ensuing power vacuum. At the time, the majority of Abkhaz and Ossetians wished to remain within the Soviet Union in order to remain closer to their Ossetian and Circassian kin in Russia, while the Georgians generally desired outright independence. Moscow began strategically supporting the South Ossetian and Abkhaz nationalist and separatist movements in order to apply leverage against the greater Georgian independence movement. And then, as tensions continued building, the local Georgian Soviet government unilaterally revoked the autonomy of South Ossetia in 1990 without receiving approval from Moscow. Fighting erupted between the South Ossetians and the Abkhaz and the Georgian government. And after Georgia declared their independence from the Soviet Union in early 1991, the fighting in Abkhazia and South Ossetia transformed into separatist rebellions that the Russian government began actively supporting with arms and volunteers. By 1993, the Russian support to the Abkhaz and South Ossetian separatists had proved decisive, with separatist forces managing to secure control over the majority of the former autonomous regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. During and after the war in Abkhazia in particular, the Abkhaz side perpetrated a mass ethnic cleansing campaign of the region's Georgian population, more than 200,000 ethnic Georgians were forcefully expelled at gunpoint from Abkhazia into the rest of Georgia, while more than 5,000 others were massacred by Abkhaz paramilitaries, which severely altered Abkhazia's demographics. Georgians plummeted from 45.7% of Abkhazia's population in 1989 to fewer than 18% by 2011. While the Abkhaz population rose from only 18% to about 51% of the total population over the same time period. Despite this, however, Georgia initially aligned itself closer to Russia by joining the Moscow-led defense alliance known as the Commonwealth of Independent States at the end of 1993, before withdrawing only half a decade later in 1999 along with Azerbaijan. And then after Vladimir Putin came to power as Russia's president in 2000, Russia began pursuing a more forward policy towards the separatist regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia with Georgia out of the CSTO. He led Russia into imposing a visa regime on Georgia at the end of 2000. And starting in 2002, he led Russia into rolling out a massive passport program to the residents of South Ossetia and Abkhazia without the Georgian government's approval, granting roughly 90% of each of their populations Russian passports and increasing Russian territorial claims to the regions in the process. Anger and resentment towards Georgia's conciliatory foreign policy to Russia, along with lingering political corruption and poverty, mounted and eventually culminated with the Rose Revolution of 2003, which overthrew the previous corrupt government led by Eduard Shevardnadze and catapulted the extremely pro-Western Mikhail Saakashvili into power as the country's next president instead, which radically altered Georgia's geopolitical alignment. The previous Georgian government had announced their intention to join NATO the year before the revolution in 2002 as Russia began giving passports to the residents in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. But Saakashvili was passionately adamant about Georgia's future in both NATO and the European Union, and he vowed that his top foreign policy priority was returning full Georgian control over the separatist regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia once again. And so, to help align Georgia more with the West and increase their odds of becoming accepted into NATO and the EU, Saakashvili led the country into sending large numbers of Georgian soldiers to support the US war efforts in both Iraq and Afghanistan. By 2008, Georgia had 2,300 of their soldiers deployed to Iraq, the third highest number of all the states in the international coalition behind only the United States and the United Kingdom themselves. While in Afghanistan, Georgia became the largest non-NATO and by far the largest per capita troop contributor, with more than 1,500 soldiers deployed there by 2012. In total, between 2004 and 2021, more than 20,000 Georgian service members served in Afghanistan, while 32 Georgian servicemen were killed in action and another 435 wounded in the country. Georgia's outsized contributions to Iraq and Afghanistan were, of course, deliberately crafted by Saakashvili's government to try and sway American and Western support for Georgia's admission to NATO and the European Union, in order to help Georgia eventually reassert its own control over their separatist regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia again. But it wasn't just Georgia's military support in Iraq and Afghanistan that was making the country more attractive to the West either. It was also the increasingly valuable space that they occupied on the board. You see, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 opened up for the first time the massive oil and gas fields of the Caspian Sea basin to the Western world. Approximately 3% of the world's oil reserves and about 7% of the world's natural gas reserves are found here around the Caspian. And while it used to all be dominated by the Soviets and blocked off from the West, the Soviet collapse placed the keys of the Caspian Sea's oil and gas resources into the hands of newly independent states like Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan. Just about every major Western energy company you can think of began moving into the region across the 1990s to break themselves into the brand new market. But they quickly found that it was going to be geographically difficult to transport the region's energy resources from the landlocked Caspian Sea to markets far away in Europe. Initially, every oil and gas pipeline from the Caspian Sea ran through Russia first, a legacy of Russia's dominance over these countries during the Soviet era. The Western energy companies wanted to construct their own oil and gas pipelines from the Caspian region that led back to Europe. But they wanted to avoid routing any of those pipelines through Iran to the south or through Russia to the north. And that left two possible options. The pipelines could either go from the Caspian Sea through Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey towards Europe, or they could go from the Caspian Sea through Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Turkey towards Europe instead. But at the time, Azerbaijan and Armenia had a very serious territorial dispute going on over the status of Nagorno-Karabakh, and the two were effectively locked in a frozen war with one another. Azerbaijan refused to consider allowing this new export route to travel through their arch geopolitical rival. And so, to avoid Armenia, the Western energy companies, along with Azerbaijan and Turkey, decided to route their new Caspian oil export pipeline north through Georgia instead. Completed in 2005, the new Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline enabled Azerbaijan to export their oil supplies through Georgia and Turkey towards the Turkish port of Ceyhan, where oil tankers carry the oil the rest of the way across the Mediterranean to markets all across Europe. The new route enabled Europe to lessen their dependence on oil imports coming in from the Middle East and Russia, and that gave Georgia's location controlling the center of the route a newfound strategic value to the Europeans. And then, everything began finally coming to a head in 2008. In February of that year, Kosovo unilaterally declared its independence from Serbia after being fully controlled by separatist forces for nearly the past decade. Kosovo's independence was almost immediately recognized by virtually every single Western country within a matter of months. And then, seizing on the precedent they believed it set, Abkhazia and South Ossetia each submitted a formal request to Russia to officially recognize their own independence from Georgia. And then, the month after that, in April of 2008, came the NATO summit in Bucharest, during which NATO's leaders publicly made promises that Georgia would one day soon be officially offered an invitation to join the alliance. But this prospect of Georgia entering into NATO horrified the Russians and was interpreted by Moscow as a firm red line that shouldn't be crossed. If Georgia flipped from being within Russia's CSTO military alliance to NATO, then Georgia would likely be supported by NATO into helping the Saakashvili government regain control over all of the separatist-controlled parts of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which would then place NATO forces largely in control over 3 of the 4 primary entrances into the steppes of southern Russia. When factoring in Turkey, NATO's border with Russia would be extended continuously all the way to the Greater Caucasus Mountains themselves, while the eastern rim of the Black Sea would be extended under NATO maritime control to position NATO maritime and air assets precipitously close by to the Russian port of Novorossiysk, which is the second most significant naval base for the Russian Black Sea Fleet after Sevastopol and Crimea, and even more importantly, it's also the most significant oil port on the Black Sea coast that sees about 2 million barrels of oil per day flowing through it as pipelines from Kazakhstan and Russia transport their oil to be loaded up onto tankers in the Novorossiysk harbor. And on top of all of that, Georgia's entrance into NATO would permanently drive a wedge between Russia and Armenia, another member of the Moscow-led CSTO military alliance that would become hugely isolated from the rest of the alliance, which would then likely enable their rivals, Azerbaijan and Turkey, to begin steadily picking the country's territory apart without a clear geographic way for their ally Russia to actually intervene to stop them. Georgia's entrance into NATO would also solidify the West's control over the Azerbaijani oil pipeline route to Ceyhan, which would serve to continue Europe's ability to lessen their economic reliance on Russian oil and energy resources in the long term. And while Russia knew that NATO was not plotting an imminent invasion of southern Russia after adding Georgia to the alliance, most states that operate in the international system, including Russia, are more concerned about capability than intent. Intent to invade can evolve with time. After all, there were few in Russia who perceived Germany to be a major existential threat in 1930. But it only took 11 years from then for Germany to launch an all-out genocidal war of conquest into Russia anyway. And while intent can evolve with time, geographic capability to attack remains constant. Georgia's admission into NATO and their subsequent subjugation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia would place NATO forces immediately opposite of the Greater Caucasus Mountains, with 3 of the primary entrances into flat southern Russia largely under their control. A highly sensitive part of the country was Russia's own most serious active separatist movements in Chechnya and Dagestan, where there were still major active armed insurgencies going on at the time. Russia was fearful that NATO could then utilize its new position in Georgia to inflame or even support the separatist movements in Chechnya and Dagestan, and undermine Russia even further, especially after they witnessed NATO attack Serbia in 1999 and prop up the separatist movement in Kosovo afterwards. If NATO did something similar to support the separatist movements in Chechnya and Dagestan in gaining independence, and then they allow NATO troops into their territories as peacekeepers, just like Kosovo did after 1999, then NATO forces would gain a direct foothold on the Eurasian steppe itself on the northern side of the Greater Caucasus Mountains, with a clear shot for tanks to advance across the flat terrain towards Astrakhan and Volgograd, 2 of Russia's most strategically important cities because they control the Volga River and Russia's access to the oil and gas fields of the Caspian Sea. In the 20th century, when Volgograd was better known as Stalingrad, the city's strategic importance was considered so great that the Soviets paid as many as 2 million lives to push the German invaders away from it. And for all of these myriad reasons, Putin's Russia calculated that NATO's promises of Georgia's membership in the alliance at the Bucharest summit in April of 2008 were simply unacceptable, and they began preparing for war. A few months later, in August of 2008, fighting broke out between South Ossetian separatist forces and the Georgian army, and Russia seized on the opportunity it presented by launching a full-scale land, sea, and air invasion of Georgia in the name of supposedly protecting the South Ossetians from a genocide that they falsely alleged the Georgians were carrying out in the territory. Russia claimed that their 2008 invasion of Georgia was a peacekeeping operation the same way that NATO asserted that their 1999 bombing of Serbia and intervention in Kosovo was. Hundreds of soldiers were killed, around 200,000 people were forcibly displaced, including tens of thousands of Georgians who were ethnically cleansed and pushed out of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. South Ossetia and Abkhazia's independences were each officially recognized by Russia, and both effectively came fully under Russian military occupation, with the establishment of multiple Russian military bases in each of them. 20% of Georgia's internationally recognized territory then effectively became extensions of Russia, and Georgia reacted by severing all diplomatic relations with Russia, which has remained the case up until the present day. Russia's victory in the war proved to be a strategic boon for the Kremlin's geographic positioning around the Greater Caucasus Mountains. Their capture of Abkhazia extended Russia's control of the Black Sea coast, established a buffer away from their critical port of Novorossiysk, and secured firm Russian control over the western coastal entrance from Western Asia into southern Russia, while their capture of South Ossetia solidified Russia's control over the entire extent of the Roki Tunnel passing through the mountains and set the Russians up on a strategic high ground area only 2 kilometers away from the Georgian military road pass, which could enable Russian forces to easily sever the road in the event of a crisis and effectively shut down all possible overland travel routes from Western Asia to southern Russia. It also placed Russian forces within very close striking distance of the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline that almost runs right up against South Ossetian territory, meaning that if they wanted to in the event of a crisis, it would be very easy for Russia to sever the pipeline and eliminate what is today a vital oil and gas artery for Europe. Further still, South Ossetia's control enabled Russian tanks and artillery to position themselves fewer than 50 kilometers or only about 30 miles away from the Georgian capital of Tbilisi. A gun permanently pointed to Georgia's head to not continue advancing its relations with the West again or else. After the disaster of the 2008 war, Mikhail Saakashvili lost the next Georgian presidential election to the reclusive billionaire Bidzina Ivanishvili and his newly founded Georgian Dream Party. Georgian Dream has remained in power in Georgia ever since, and while Ivanishvili only served as the country's official leader for a single year from 2012 to 2013, he has been widely believed to have maintained his power over the party and the leaders they've appointed to govern in Georgia behind closed doors ever since. Ivanishvili was born into poverty in Soviet Georgia, but he relocated to Moscow in the 1980s, and managed to emerge as a newly minted oligarch in the mining and banking industries during the gangster-ridden chaos of Russia in the 1990s, before eventually returning back to his native Georgia again. Today, Ivanishvili is by far the wealthiest man alive in Georgia, with an estimated net worth of approximately $6 billion, which is roughly equivalent to a third of Georgia's entire annual GDP. He ran on a campaign in 2012 of balancing Georgia's complicated relationship between Russia and the West, and positioned himself with his decades of prior experience in business relations with Russia as a guarantor of further stability, while he painted Mikhail Saakashvili as being a too pro-Western figure who would only continue exacerbating tensions with Moscow that could provoke another war. The strategy proved very effective, and in the years since then, the Georgian Dream has argued that in order for Georgia to ever become accepted into institutions like the EU and NATO, the country requires stable and normalized relations with Russia first, so that the West doesn't ever believe that Georgia will drag them into a war. The party paid lip service to continuing with Georgia's bids to join NATO and the EU, but in reality carried out very little actual efforts to pursue them as it sought to repair the shattered relationship with Russia first. Meanwhile, Georgia's geopolitical position to the West has grown increasingly more important since the Georgian Dream took over. Between 2008 and 2020, approximately $45 billion was invested into developing a series of natural gas pipelines connecting the massive gas fields of Azerbaijan with Europe. that has become known as the Southern Gas Corridor. And just like the previous Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline that came before it, the Southern Gas Corridor routes through Georgia instead of Armenia, due to Azerbaijan's opposition of having it routed through their arch-rival Armenia. Azerbaijan's direct natural gas exports to Europe through the Southern Gas Corridor began only in 2020. And then the route became even more critically important in 2022 after the Russians invaded Ukraine. And Europe decided to rapidly shift their previously high imports of Russian oil and gas to alternative providers instead. Azerbaijan, with its massive gas fields in the Caspian Sea and the existing infrastructure and relationships already in place, was one of the most logical alternatives for the Europeans to court for additional supplies. And as a result, Azerbaijan pledged to double their pre-invasion gas exports to Europe through the Southern Gas Corridor by 2027, by which point, if all else remains equal, Azerbaijan will be providing the European Union with as much as 6 to 7% of their entire natural gas consumption through the pipeline that runs through Georgia, which dramatically increases Georgia's strategic significance to the West. And so, that largely explains why the European Union finally granted Georgia their long-awaited candidacy status just a few months ago in December of 2023. And now, Russia would like to keep Georgia out of joining the EU and NATO for very similar reasons as they did back in 2008. But they also have even more reasons to prevent Georgia from aligning too closely with the West today, too. With the Russian Navy suffering heavy losses to the Ukrainians since the war began in 2022, the Russian Black Sea Fleet has been largely driven out of its traditional bases in Crimea and forced to relocate itself to Novorossiysk on the Black Sea's eastern rim. While there has been much discussion about expanding the Black Sea Fleet's presence in Abkhazia with a proposed new deep-water base that could end up being constructed here at Ochimchire, which would place Russian naval assets based there out of range of most of Ukraine's weapons while still enabling them to continue operating in the Black Sea region. Developing the port at Ochimchire would serve a dual-purpose objective for the Kremlin, because it would also jeopardize the EU's plans to assist Georgia with developing their own nearby deep-water port here at Anaklia. As it currently stands now, Georgia doesn't have any deep-water ports, which means that only smaller displacement ships can carry goods from the country's two primary ports at Batumi and Poti, which severely restricts the volume of goods that Georgian ports are capable of actually exporting. If Anaklia was therefore developed into the country's first proper deep-water port, it could handle substantially larger cargo container vessels than what is currently possible, which would enhance Georgia's ability to export large volumes of products, which would greatly enhance Georgia's geopolitical location at the epicenter of what is being called the Middle Corridor trade route, a proposed trade network of freight railways, highways, ports, and ferries connecting China with Europe by land without having any part of the route traveling through Western geopolitical opponents like Iran or Russia, or Azeri and Turkish geopolitical opponents like Armenia. This makes Georgia the absolute linchpin in making the Middle Corridor route actually viable, as the transformation of Anaklia into a deepwater harbor would open up the ability for Chinese manufactured goods to travel overland to the port and then get moved en masse aboard large cargo container vessels the rest of the way to markets in Europe, all while avoiding Russia, Iran, and Armenia in the process. In addition to all of the critical oil and gas pipelines from the Caspian Sea to Europe that runs through Georgia, this makes Georgia an absolutely critical space for the Europeans to consider having aligned on their side. And it's why the Europeans are very interested in helping the Georgians with developing this deep-water port at Anaklia. EU companies as well as Chinese companies have all staked out bids to construct the port, while the Russians would clearly prefer the Chinese to construct and develop the port over the Europeans, in order to ensure Chinese influence and control over the entire length of the Middle Corridor trade route. Russia might even simply prefer that Anaklia never be developed at all, in order to just block the Middle Corridor route's viability entirely, and force Europe to continue relying either on the Northern Corridor land route that runs through Russia, or the much longer southern maritime route through the Suez Canal or around the Cape of Africa. And what better way to shut the port's prospects down than by constructing a brand new naval base in Abkhazia at Ochimchire, only 36 kilometers away from it, that could become a target of the war in Ukraine. Georgia has entertained both sides in the port's development, and Georgia is well aware of their increased geopolitical value to both the West and to Russia since 2022. It may even be possible that the Georgian Dream government has weaponized the prospect of them drawing closer to Russia and China in order to simply exert more leverage on Western countries and companies to get better terms out of them on Anaklia's development and ownership. But now, with the imminent passing of the Georgian Dream's new foreign influence law in the country that could enable the government to crack down on opposition media outlets and suppress dissent, Georgia's geopolitical future has never been more up in the air as it is now. The EU and NATO have both heavily criticized the law and have said that its passing is incompatible with their values, which jeopardizes Georgia's ability to align itself with the West and might push the government to move even further than it already has into the camp of Russia and China. It's also conceivably possible that the wide-scale protests going on in Georgia right now against the law could eventually evolve into a Georgian version of the Maidan Revolution that exploded in Ukraine back in 2014 that toppled what was then Ukraine's deeply pro-Russian government. But if something like that were to happen again in Georgia today, it is almost a certainty that the moment it appeared the Georgian Dream Party was about to lose its grip on power, the Kremlin would calculate that another military intervention into the country to support them would become necessary. Moscow would almost certainly attempt to label any potential revolt in Georgia as a US and Ukraine-backed color revolution and coup, and then they would use that as a pretext to justify sending in soldiers again in support of the government. And just because the Russian armed forces are massively bogged down at the moment in Ukraine doesn't mean that Moscow wouldn't have the bandwidth to also send in an intervention in Georgia. There is very, very high precedent for Russia doing things like this, going back to their 2014 intervention in Ukraine after the Maidan Revolution when they seized Crimea, their 2020 intervention into Belarus to help quash pro-Western protests that erupted against the Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko, and their January 2022 intervention into Kazakhstan to help quash anti-government protests that had erupted there as well. Approximately 2,000 Russian soldiers had been deployed to Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan as peacekeepers. But after Azerbaijan overran the territory in September of 2023 and the Armenian government collapsed there, the Russians suddenly announced in April of 2024 that they would be withdrawing all 2,000 of their troops from the area. And it's anyone's best guess where they might end up getting redeployed to, potentially to Ukraine, or to potentially monitor the evolving situation in Georgia. If Russia had the excuse to launch an intervention into Georgia again today, they could deliberately sabotage the major oil and gas pipelines in Georgia connecting Azerbaijan's fields to Europe, which would eliminate a huge amount of Europe's energy supplies and apply significantly higher economic and inflationary pressures on Europe in the process. They could also claw out a land bridge to their theoretical CSTO ally Armenia, and establish a continuous land connection all the way to Iran in the process, who is increasingly becoming a close economic and military ally of Russia's today. And they would also guarantee that the Middle Corridor trade route project between the West and China would be forever a dead and buried idea, enhancing their own leverage on Europe to come back to relying on their own Northern Corridor trade route instead. Since the Georgian Dream Party often tries to portray themselves as the agents of stability between the East and the West and the only thing that stands between the Georgian people and another Russian invasion, the Kremlin might also reason that another major intervention into Georgia could serve the purpose of effectively shocking the Georgian population into falling back in line with their own increasingly authoritarian and pro-Russian government. In the end, Georgia's future is a deeply uncertain one right now, and it remains to be seen how the country's geography will continue affecting its complicated destiny between East and West going forward. Now, there's a lot of data that goes into producing these kinds of videos, whether it's showing the percentages of Georgians who wish to join the European Union, why Russia is so concerned about controlling the Greater Caucasus Mountains range, how much of the world's oil and gas reserves can be found around the Caspian Sea, and how the Europeans and Western energy companies chose to route their pipelines from the area. The ability to visualize raw data like this on the map is exactly what makes learning so fascinating to me, and it's why the Exploring Data Visually course is one of my favorite courses that I've ever taken with this video's sponsor, Brilliant.org. Brilliant.org is a STEM learning platform that helps you learn by actually doing. They don't just give you a mountain of text and then expect you to remember everything you read. They use interactive exercises to teach you the intuitive principles. Then build these principles upon each other so that you can genuinely understand complex subjects like data visualization and analysis, statistics, computer science, astrophysics, and tons of others. They really know how to teach for results, which is why Brilliant.org is perfect for the kind of person who wants to learn because they love learning, not because they're being forced to. And best of all, with our mobile app and smaller bite-sized course chunks, it's really possible to fit learning on Brilliant.org into any schedule, no matter how busy your day-to-day activities are. So if you're the type of person who loves learning new things, you can try out everything Brilliant.org has to offer for free for a full 30 days by clicking the button here on your screen right now, or by visiting Brilliant.org/RealLifeLore, or by clicking the link down below in the description. And best of all, you'll also get 20% off of an annual premium subscription if you do so. And as always, thank you so much for watching.